I can say that I started coming kind of from an odd angle because was raised basically by a survivalist. And so surviving was one of those things that kind of pulled me in. And I'm also, my master's is in history. And so when I started reading alternative history fiction, it was sort of, okay, how can we get the two of these things together? And especially being out as a lesbian, I started thinking about, how am I going to fit in? I mean, you read some of these of alternative histories of the Confederacy winning, or the Nazis winning, or the Japanese winning, or anything like that. And you suddenly start thinking, okay, how am I, as a woman, as a lesbian, would I ever survive in this? And so that's basically, you know, kind of where I came through with my stuff is, how would we survive this? How can we make a world for ourselves, all of us outsiders? And so that's how I came to dystopia.
I came in sideways. I was actually, as a teenager, I was more interested in anything that my parents disapproved of, which at the time included Stephen King novels. I don't like horror, but I read The Stand, and The Stand was not only dystopian and then post-apocalyptic, but it featured probably the first queer character that I knew, where I knew what that meant. So that interest sparked not only, okay, where can I find stories with more of these lesbian characters, even though I wasn't quite figuring that out yet. Where can I find more post-apocalyptic stuff? Where can I find more dystopian stuff? And sometimes those braids, those different lines braid, and sometimes they don't. But that's what started me on the path.
Well, I would say my first experience with dystopian writing was Lois Lowry as a kid, The Giver. But actually, the book that spoke to me that she wrote wasn't The Giver so much as Gathering Blue. I read the two, and I realized that I related to Gathering Blue more. They're in the same universe, although different civilizations. I realized I related it more because it had a female protagonist, and you know, dystopia kind of hits different when you're not cis male. And so then I got to be a teenager, and I started reading Kurt Vonnegut, Ray Bradbury, you know, those guys, and some of their stuff was really interesting, and I was into it. But then I kept thinking, like, well, what about me? What about people like me? And I looked around, and there are all of these cool concepts, but a lot of the main characters were just, to be honest, unlikable. So I thought, well, I should write my own. And I'm delighted to say that now there's a much wider breadth in dystopian fiction than there was even 10 years previously. So you love to see it.
Is it down to me and you, Casey?
Flip a coin, doesn't matter to me.
Well, I will piggyback off of what Ray just said, because that was somewhat similar to my experience. You know, I think most of us here probably devoured far too much of the library than we should have at our tender years. But then I'm not sure when The Hunger Games came out, but it was shortly as I was entering teenagehood when all of a sudden there was this surge of YA novels that had female protagonists or protagonists who were not, you know, cisgendered men, and that really, yeah, I mean, it's hard to, you don't want to say you were inspired by, you know, everything is awful all the time, right? But it just and that coincided pretty quickly with my interest in environmental catastrophe. Another thing that, you know, you don't really want to say, I'm interested in environmental catastrophe, right? But I am, it's true. So those two genres just seemed like my calling.
Well, mine actually is similar to all the others. I ran into a book that made me think, wow, this is exciting, although it's bad scenarios happening. Like you said, it's hard to get into things that are dystopian in nature and say they're good. But The Stand, for me, like Stephen King, The Stand, that was a book in my adolescence that I ran across. And I was weird enough to think and fantasize about, well, what if I was in that world that was happening, that I was reading, that what would I do to survive, and what would I do to, make friends if I was immune and get through this catastrophe. And that's how it all started. And I started writing, even starting then, way back, little short stories about the end of the world and what would happen. And lo and behold, it became the Darkness series, which got published. So that's how I got started.
There's some overlap in those answers where people are talking about wanting to see themselves represented and wanting it to not just be like this straight cis males as the protagonist, which I think is a really great lead into our next question, which is, how do you see the queer narrative shaping dystopian fiction?
The future is queer, right? I mean, I would say that, I don't even say that tongue in cheek. I mean, I teach young people, and I don't want to say that they are mostly queer, because my study sample is a little bit skewed at the college that I teach at. But I think that, as sexuality it is I am trying to figure out how to word this, the fastest growing acceptance of any sort of societal change ever, right? I mean, we haven't seen that ever before. We certainly haven't seen it with race, but in terms of sexuality, that's opening up. And I think that if we are going to, make any headway in averting dystopias or surviving dystopias or having these stories, we need all the voices that we can. And so when I say, I think that the future is queer, what I mean by that is that any sort of sustainable future embraces all of these voices.
It's really important for queer people, especially, I think, to see themselves in dystopian fiction, because, we're survivors, right? Queer people have to endure a whole lot of stuff just by virtue of our existence. And you can't survive against adversity if you don't have a picture of what that survival looks like. You can't imagine yourself as a happy, healthy adult, for example, if you don't have examples of that in your life. You can't imagine it for yourself. And that's where the It Gets Better project and similar things later came from, is the desire to see ourselves in the future and to know that we would be okay. And dystopian fiction is just taking that to a whole nother level. How can queer people as a group in a community see ourselves in the future if we can't even imagine it in the first place? And that's where writing helps. It's the first step toward actualization.
One of the big things that I talk about when I do a lot of my political activism and getting more people involved is the fact that if you're not at the table, you're going to be on the menu. And so with dystopians, everybody who is not there is on the menu. And so I think with the perspective we bring as women, as queer women, as lesbians, that this is what we need in order to turn so that we can figure out how that survival will be, because too many times we are on that menu. And this is the best way, for at least for me, to envision, okay, we had some pretty hard times these last few years, and we're going through some really yeasty stuff within the United States. How can we figure out a way for us to be part of this new future that we're trying to create? And I think playing with a dystopia is the way, at least for me, helps me stay sane with everything else that's going crazy in the world.